All right, it seems like we are on air now. Hello, everyone, and good morning. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to our online hackathon on air. My name is Alexander Nordmark. I personally work toward the Swedish market on our sales team. But for today, I am the lucky presenter or introducer to this lovely hangout where we will be focusing on mobile speed. And together with my colleagues, we are lucky enough to have gotten access to Bas Jensen, a conversion specialist, and Frank Brorsen, pardon my Dutch, who works as a customer solutions engine. And they will be kicking off this presentation during the morning. And then following that, Subir Majumdar, who is our regional product specialist in mobile, will be taking over and discussing a little bit about accelerated mobile pages. Also, please look down in the comment section and make sure to join our G+ community, because part of the best part about having this is getting you all together, having you all psyched up about mSpeed, and it would be great to see you guys posting questions there and upvoting the ones that are most relevant to you, so that our Google specialists can make sure to prioritize the questions that are most relevant to you. And yeah, well, with that, I am going to pop off for a little while and hand over to my dear colleagues, Bas and Frank. Good luck, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. All right, so let me share my screen so you guys can actually see the presentation as well. So what we're going to cover today is why speed is important, how we can actually measure it, how we can then improve it, and like Alexander said, how you can actually start working with accelerated mobile pages. So my role is a conversion specialist here at Google, and I want to tell you why speed is really important. Because as you know, we care a lot about speed. If you enter any search query into our search engine, you'll see that a lot of the times we deliver you the results in only half a second. And it's not a secret that page speed is a ranking signal for our search results. And lately we also announced that there will be a separate organic listing for just the mobile results specifically. So if you combine that, and you know that speed is really important for organic search listings. But next to that, there's another indirect effect on why site speed is actually having effect on your paid performance. And here you see a breakdown on how our AdWords auction system actually works. And one of the elements that it looks at is quality score. And quality score is then decided again by the landing page quality. And of course, the landing page quality is directly correlated with the actual loading speed. So you'll see that if you increase the speed of your landing pages, a lot of the time the performance in AdWords also goes up. So now you understand that there's improvements in both organic and paid search results, but there's more to this because lately in August this year, Facebook announced that if signals indicate the web page will load quickly, the link to that web page might appear higher in the Facebook feed. So as VentureBeat put it very nicely, website owners now have actually 3 reasons to make their mobile sites faster. Their users, Google and Facebook, and of course their users are the most important here. So if we dive a little bit deeper into user behavior and site speed, then it's really important to understand that it's all about the perception of speed. And if a page loads under like 3 seconds, then in general people say this is really good, it feels well, and it's easy to work with. But as soon as you get above that 3-second threshold, then people will start actually feeling this is slow. And if you go above 7 seconds, then a lot of the times you lose already most of your audience. And you can actually see on the right that there's a lot of impact that improved page load time can have on the conversion rate. And for any business, any online business, this is of course really important to realize that as soon as you, as developers, make improvements to the load time, you can actually help your colleagues over at the e-commerce department with actually achieving their targets. Also, in the Netherlands recently, a company called Braingineers has done some neurousability research where they actually look at the brain of the user when they do certain tasks. And what they found was that if people are actually experiencing slower loading pages, then the sentiment becomes that they are getting a negative feeling. And with that negative feeling, they actually show more behavior that will result in actually abandoning the shopping carts. So more and more, the feeling is really about making sure, the point here as I'm trying to make is really make sure that the user feels that the page is actually loading really quick. And of course, if as soon as you make that decision, as soon as you make sure that people get a fast loading experience, then you'll see that probably back in also conversion rates. So here are some cases of large companies that have seen actually an increase when they improved their loading page time. They also saw an increase in conversion rate. So this could be, for our case, it was if we slowed down our page, then less people will search. But for instance, Amazon showed that if they increase their site loading time, they get immediately more revenue. And this is important to realize because through this, you can actually help to achieve that site speed optimizations get high on the agenda, higher on your development roadmap than other issues like building new features, because you can prove that improving site speed will actually deliver better business results. So hopefully by now you understand why speed is important. To top it off, I have one final chart to show you guys. And this is mostly about conversion rate and related again with loading time. But if you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that the loading time is only 3.3 seconds or 3.0 seconds. So only a 0.3 difference already has a lot of impact on the conversion rate, which is here plotted by the pink graph. So you'll see in this case, for this particular example, that the sweet spot was around 2.4 seconds. And a lot of the times, this is something that you can pull yourself, this kind of data, just to correlate conversion rate with load time and see what for you guys is the sweet spot to work towards. So now, why is this really important? Because recently we looked at over 150,000 of mobile landing pages, and we found out that in 70% of the cases, people were looking at this screen for at least 5 seconds, and only then something appeared on the screen. And if you then think back of what I just said about giving the users the perception that the site loads fast, at least giving the user an indication that the site is actually loading, like showing a logo or something else, is already a good start into making sure that user is happy and hopefully will convert much better. So now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Frank, who will tell you about how you can measure site speed performance.
Yes, thank you, Bas. So first of all, when looking at mobile site speed, there are many metrics that we can look at. As you can see on the screen, I've picked 5, but there are more. Looking at these, load time in this case is 4 seconds, time to first byte 0.8, etc. One that I'm going to dive more deeper into, because I find it one of the more important ones, in this case, is the speed index. Now, why is the speed index important? Reason for this is because it gives us an indication of how does the user perceive the speed of this page. We've made a small demo on a small HTML page where on the top page you can see a speed index of 750, and on the bottom page a speed index of 1500. The difference in these two pages is actually only the way the source code is built up. So they both have the same number of images, the same number of CSS files and JavaScript files, except by changing the way the browser renders the page, the feeling that the user has when looking at the page is way better. And this is visible through the speed index. So how do we measure this at Google? Is actually by using an open source tool, which is called Web Page Test. You can see here on the GIF how we measure it actually specifically. We look at 3G fast connection because the world is bigger than your own country where you have a normal 4G connection. We usually run 3 tests to sort of get a proper average of what is the loading time, looking at first view only, and make sure to emulate a mobile browser because not only the strength of the connection and the number of megabytes per second that the browser can receive is important, also the resources that the browser has available to render the page. You can imagine that a laptop has way more CPU to render the page than a mobile device. And here you can see some example output of the results from web page sets. So in this case, this page has a speed index of 2,413, which is pretty good. So within 2.5 seconds, the user can use the page and has a fast feel of this page. Going one step further for you as developers, because of course, every time you deliver a new web page, it is super fast. Then you hand it off to your marketing department. They add a lot of images, they add more pixels. So how do you make sure that also over time your speed stays in line with what you set as a KPI is by using the API of web page test. Or alternatively, host your own version. As it is open source, you can download the source of web page test and then run it on your own server and have your own pages tested automatically, for example, every day. So you can see with that a drop in page speed, so your page becoming slower, probably will also cause a lower conversion rate. And with that, you can prove that to your marketing department. So next, I'm going to talk about images, because what we see here is that most of the problems about slow mobile pages is coming from images, as is described here on the slide. And one of the reasons is these two CSS selectors, right? On the left, you see that image with a max width of 100% makes it really easy for a developer on a responsive site to have a very large image displayed to the size of the mobile screen. And on the right, of course, very obvious, using CSS, you can hide an image that is on the page. The problem with this is that the browser still needs to download the size of the image that a desktop browser would see, meaning that you can have a nice 1 megabyte image on desktop, now is displayed very tiny on the mobile screen by using this CSS selector, which is of course a waste of bandwidth in this case. For that, we recommend you to use, for example, SourceSet or any other CSS frameworks for loading responsive images, so that depending on the size of the browser, you load the right resolution of the image. So a browser with a small screen would load a smaller image, a browser with a big screen load a bigger image. In this case, this is already natively supported in Chrome. Similar for using background images, what we actually often see is that you build a website for desktop only, and then depending on which browser is using the website, you add media CSS tags to load different background images. In this case, it is implemented in a very good way because depending on the screen size, a different background image is loaded. But what we often see is that there is first one big image being downloaded and then a smaller image. So recommended also to always add media classifiers for each type of screen, not just to override the default ones. And lastly, here you can see an example of using display none. At the bottom in the network tab, you see that the image is still being downloaded, even though in the browser it's not being displayed. So this is basically wasting one connection and downloading one image for no good reason. So make sure that if an image is not necessary on mobile, you don't download it. So here, that is once again shown with an example with a CSS classifier. So in this case, on a small device, do not download the image. On a large device, actively download the image. Next up, since you probably work with designers who want to have beautiful images that are 4K ready, we would like you to think about giving up some of the details of the images to increase your performance. So in this case, an example of what Amazon does very well is that they compress their images, right? As you can see, the image on the left is only 8.4 kilobytes big for an image that is populating almost half of the screen, right? So using Photoshop or even preferably a backend automated tool to make the size of the images smaller for mobile devices, because users will spend less time looking at the images, and also the fact that it is a little bit lower quality will probably not influence your conversion rates. And as you can see here, an example, there are two different images. One is 150 kilobytes, almost double the size of the 86 kilobytes on the right. And to me, they look pretty similar, right? So give up some of the details of the images, compress them to increase your mobile speed. Next up, one that is, I guess, very obvious, but not always implemented due to whatever reasons, is lazy loading or load on demand, right? So what happens is when you send a page to the browser with 20 different images, but you're not telling the browser which image to download first, it will just at random pick which image to download, meaning that it may download 6 images at the same time, which lowers the download speed, right? If your maximum download speed of your browser is 1.8 megabyte and it's downloading 6 images at the same time, each image can only download with 300 kilobytes per second, meaning that if your images are 3 megabyte large, they all take 3 seconds minimum to download. That's why we would recommend you to implement lazy loading, right? Download the images only when the user needs them. You can see here in an example, when the user starts scrolling, the images start downloading. And that way we can enforce that what the user sees first, and this relates back to the speed index, is also downloaded first by the browser. And here's an example of a JavaScript framework. There are many more to implement this. So I'm sure you can use Stack Overflow or follow this GitHub link to start implementing this on your site. Next up, image sliders. Who doesn't love them? We would recommend you to remove the image slider. And there's a couple obvious reasons. First of all, poor performance. What often happens is you're trying to put a lot of information into a very small screen, which I think it's as listed as point number 5. I find it the most important reason. Makes your slider look like a public transport ad, right? Next to that, you need multiple images and quite some JavaScript to run this. What we see very often is that before the first image has loaded, the slider already starts moving, meaning that you cannot even read what is on the slide before it goes to the next slide. And then 3 other reasons is that, well, basically it gives you poor performance. 90% of the people that actually click on the slider only click on the first slide. And thirdly, it is just distracting the user, right? How often do you look at a mobile page and you're not scrolling straight away to look for the content that you actually want to read, right? And here you can see an example. At the top, what is happening is that if we would use only a static image, the page would load very fast. You see at the bottom of the top part is that the slider already starts moving before the second image has loaded. And then by the time the second slide has loaded, actually the slider has already slided back to the first image. Ooh-pew. So, right, remove it. It's not necessary. And here is the research actually that has been done by nd.edu, showing where do your users click, right? So the majority of the users clicks on the first slide, position 2, 3, 4, 5, and beyond receive almost 0 to none clicks. And then lastly, look at the big players, right? How are the big companies doing this? For example, in Amazon, it's just using one static image. Cdiscount uses one static image. They are no longer using sliders on their M site because they're not effective. Next up, concatenating and spriting. So another important aspect on mobile is bandwidth, right? Meaning there are two bottlenecks to sort of describe on desktop versus mobile. On desktop, the bottleneck for your website is the number of bytes. Having a site that is 3 megabytes versus 1 megabyte will show a big difference in speed, right? The more you load, the longer it takes. While on mobile, because of the network restrictions and the device in terms of resources it can download at the same time, the bottleneck is the number of requests. Each request gives you your mobile site overhead, slowing down your site. And reason for that is that every time your mobile device downloads an asset, it can be an icon, a CSS file, a JavaScript file, it has to connect to the mobile network. The mobile network has to connect to your server. The server has to send the file back to the mobile network and back to your device, right? This is what we call a round trip. Every time you have a round trip, you have overhead, meaning that if you have 5 CSS files and you concatenate them to one, you may already win half a second in terms of overhead. And for the user, the end result is the same in terms of what he sees, but the site will be way faster. So reduce the overhead on mobile by spriting your images and concatenating your other assets like CSS and JavaScript files. Then going into something more complicated. And this is a difficult one because you already probably have a complete site that is running right now, which means this is difficult to implement for you. So we're talking about the critical render path. And the idea with the critical render part is to help the browser prioritize the loading of the content, and specifically the content above the fold. And here's an example of what that would look like. Both pages have exactly the same content, but by optimizing the way the page is loaded, so using progressive rendering, we can tell the browser first download the bar at the top, then show the little text at the top, maybe the 3 little icons below, and then the rest of the content. This way, within 0.3 seconds, the user already feels that something is happening on his page. So he's more likely to wait what the page is going to offer him more. And that compared to unoptimized rendering at the bottom, it takes 1.5 seconds before the user can interact with the page. Another thing we very often see is like what you see on the screen, is that the browser is loading for about 4.5 seconds. And then after 5 seconds, the screen turns black. And then in this case, at the 6-second mark, the screen turns back to the normal page again. So what is going on here? Sorry about that. What is going on here is that at the 4.5 second mark, the browser was running into something that was render blocking, meaning that when something is render blocking, the browser will stop whatever it is doing to download this resource. And what are resources that are render blocking? CSS and JavaScript files. So what happens is when the browser is rendering a page is that first it is parsing all the HTML, then it is applying the CSS, then hopefully executing JavaScript, mashing it all together and painting the layout. So why did they decide to make CSS render blocking? Basically meaning that when a browser sees a CSS file, it will stop rendering the page. Is because, as you can see in this example, You may start with the standard paragraph styling and then override those styles, then override the size, etc. Meaning that if this resource would not be render blocking, then your page would look like a disco, right? The text would first be red, then it will blink to green, then maybe the size would change, etc. So whenever the browser sees a CSS file, it will stop rendering the page. And you can simply show this with a demo. If you use, for example, PHP to load your CSS, if you let the PHP sleep for 8 seconds before returning the CSS to the browser, you will see nothing for 8 seconds, and then you will see your entire page. Similarly, this happens with JavaScript. So as soon as the browser sees a script tag or a script source, it will stop rendering the page. The reason for this is not because the styles might change, but more because it is expected that the JavaScript will change the DOM, for example. It will add an element to the page. So what happens, and you can see that here on the slide, is that in the green part on the left, the browser is parsing the HTML. Then it sees the JavaScript file in the source, the script tag in this case. It will download the script, as you can see in the purple, and then it will execute the script. And then the browser will continue parsing the HTML. And you can also prove this similar to the CSS demo by waiting 8 seconds using PHP or your favorite programming language before returning the JavaScript in this case. So what we would recommend in this case is simply move your scripts to the bottom of the page, right? So just before the body closing tag, even though it says in this slide after the body closing tag, because in that case, the browser will still show all the content and then start downloading the JavaScript and executing the JavaScript. Next up is another optimization of loading your JavaScript. So you probably have seen this error before, right? Your page has one blocking script resources, which causes delay in rendering your page, right? And this is due to the same problem as I stated earlier. So what we can do here in terms of JavaScript is optimizing the way the JavaScript is loaded. So on the top, you see the way a normal script tag is loaded and interpreted, right? The browser is parsing the HTML, the JavaScript is downloaded and executed. Then the browser starts continuing parsing the HTML. Using the async tag, we tell the browser to continue parsing the HTML while the JavaScript is being downloaded and only stop parsing the HTML when the script is being executed. And then continuing parsing the HTML. Next to that, we can also use defer, which is basically telling the browser to download the script while the HTML is being parsed and execute the JavaScript when the entire HTML is parsed, so at the end of the page. Load. And with that summarizing, put your JavaScript in the footer, utilize defer and async. So defer your JavaScript if the execution order of the script is important. So meaning that if your JavaScript renders part of the page and you don't want to run your JavaScript when the entire page is being rendered, defer it. If the script does nothing to the page, so for example, fire a tracking pixel, use async and make sure that it executes the JavaScript at the end of the page to show the user a better user experience. Next to that, we can do something similar to optimize the loading of CSS. So similar to JavaScript, CSS is render blocking. In this case, we see two blocking CSS resources. First of all, we would recommend to concatenate them to reduce the number of requests that's being made from 2 to 1. And next to that, inline the critical CSS. So using, for example, a Node.js framework, you can extract all the CSS that is necessary to render the above the fold content or the first screen content. What we can do there is inline this CSS, so send it using style tags instead of using an external CSS file, and then use JavaScript to load the rest of the CSS. This way, when the browser receives the first bit of HTML, it will also already have all the styles in line and can start rendering the page. And this is an example of a Node.js extraction that you can use to generate your critical CSS. Next to that, what you could do on top of that is once the user starts scrolling, or once the first paint has been done and the user can use the page, load the rest of the CSS, so the non-critical CSS. And there's also JavaScript frameworks for this. And here you can see an example of an implementation. So on top, the page loads within 0.7 seconds, at the bottom at the 1.6 seconds mark. And overall, this page uses the same resources, so the same number of images, the same size of CSS and JavaScript. The only thing that has changed is that JavaScript is being implemented using async, so it is executed at the end of the page, and the CSS has been inlined for however possible. So to summarize, start measuring mSpeed and try and use it as a KPI within your organization. Next to that, optimize your images, so compress your images, lazy load your images, and try and not use sliders. Use the research to show your statistics, or maybe check your Google Analytics for your click statistics on your slider. Next to that, optimize your assets, so concatenate your CSS and JavaScript to reduce the overhead on mobile networks. And lastly, more complicated, optimize your critical render path. So prioritize above the fold content, tell the browser which resources to download first, and optimize the delivery of your JavaScript and CSS. Up next is AMP.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Bas and Frank, for showing us how the Google experts speed up their home pages and thereby optimize conversions. Now, as the Hackathon on Air is very much a workshop and is dependent on your participation, now for the next half hour, try and sit down, work on your test URLs, and apply the learnings that we have been given from Bas and Frank. And we will be back at exactly 10 a.m. Together with Sabir for a section on AMP. And please go to the G+ page and post all of your questions there so that we can help you out along the way. See you guys at 10 a.m.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're still there. My name is Subir, and I'm here to give you a small talk on accelerated mobile pages and why we are so excited
Hi
about it.
everyone. I hope you're still there. My name is Subir, and
So, to start off with AMP, let me see if I can pull up the presentation first. Um, Could you just give us a quick shout out if you're able to see the presentation on the chat? Yeah. All right. So hopefully it's coming up for all of you. Now, when we talk about AMP, I think one of the first things that comes to our mind is that what exactly was the philosophy behind it. And one quote from Jeff Bezos really strikes out for us is, and this is something that he tells his technical team or the developer team at Amazon, that their target for latency is 1 second. And I think that principle and that goal is pretty ambitious. I'm not saying Amazon has already achieved it, but I think it's admirable that a company wants to set that as a target. And we too have taken it a bit personally, which is why we started off with uh, the concept behind accelerated mobile pages. Now, I presume most of you are already aware of it, but those of you who are not, this is an open source initiative that we started about a couple of years back. And the idea behind it was essentially how could we make the mobile web a lot more faster and easier to navigate for our users all around the world. Now, when we started off with AMP, I think one of the goals was to probably provide a bit more discipline into how mobile web pages are created today, which means that you should probably not end up using the resources or resources that consume too much of the bandwidth and essentially lead to slowing down of pages. How could you be more austere and more disciplined in terms of your use around those pages, and how that can essentially simplify most of the backend for a web page. When we started off with AMP, I think, and we started looking for partners to help us, bring this to the consumers. The first partners we really got in touch with were the newspaper websites, or more or less content sites. The reason for that is that if you look at most content sites out there, or most newspaper websites, their web pages are essentially a bunch of images and text. And due to this essentially high reliance on static content, this would probably be the lowest hanging fruit in the mobile web if we were to optimize anything. Now, we partnered up with the likes of The Guardian, the New York Times, and many such publishers. And what we were able to see in terms of results was the median load time by using AMP was about 0.7 seconds, which was a huge improvement from what they used to see before. Not only were their web pages almost 4 times faster, they also took 10 times less data. Now, this becomes very important, especially in countries where data plans are still quite expensive. So a user could potentially browse through more pages of a website, but still not consume as much from the data plan. Now, for those of you who have not experienced what an AMP really looks or feels like, I've given a small example search phrase over here. It's bestdeals.today space juicers. It's one of the websites we've worked on, but if you just search for something that is more topical in nature these days, if you want to search for, say, something like the Brexit or the German elections, you will be able to see on your smartphone quite a few links coming up which have a lightning bolt icon and the word AMP written next to it. So if you just want to quickly give it a try, I'll give you like about half a minute. Hopefully it shouldn't take you more time than that, because the technology is supposed to be super fast. So I'll just give you a few seconds. Just take out your smartphones if you haven't ever experienced an AMP and search for something topical like the Brexit or the German elections, and you should be able to see AMPs coming up and see how they really feel like to the end user. Also, another thing to note over here is that when you're looking through the organic search for, say, something like that, now even though AMP is another speed mechanism that a lot of our publishers tend to follow, it's also probably the most amount of free branding you can get on organic search. So if you understand, like, if you have an AMP page that comes up on organic search results, they will always have that lightning icon and the word AMP written next to it, which is probably the most amount of free branding you can get on the organic search. So now all that is great, but how do you start building AMP pages? And I did notice there were a few questions coming up on the G+ page as well. So I would suggest that the first place you go to refer to all kinds of examples, templates, samples, demos, what can really help you understand that here is my use case, and is there an AMP example that is already available? You should go to ampbyexample.com. It's a great resource, will give you a lot of different templates that you can look at. Another resource that is good to start off with, especially when you're considering how to manage the user interface and the fonts and the buttons and some of the more smaller nuances while developing an AMP page, ampstart.com is a great resource to start with. So both of these resources should be your best friends if you're trying to develop an AMP page for your website. Now, I spoke a lot about how news publishers have been benefiting with AMP, but with time, we've also seen more and more commercial applications of AMP coming to the fore. Womp Mobile, which is an e-commerce platform, was one of the first examples of this. And what they did was essentially they made sure that their partners like Campmore or Portero, both of them created AMP pages for their product lines. And what they were able to see was that there was a 105% increase in conversion rates and a 31% decrease in bounce rates just by making sure that AMP pages were serving for most of the key categories and products. And if you understand in its sense, it's not that they did anything vastly different with their advertising. It's just that by making sure that there are a few basic hygiene checks in place, and in its sense, AMP is basically hygiene, which makes sure that you're using the least possible number of resources to get a page out there. And that's essentially what led to the immense increase in their conversion rates and decline in bounce rates. What was also interesting to note is that now that we've had some time with using AMP and partnering on AMP with several different kinds of businesses, we've noticed that almost 80% of developer teams usually take less than a week to develop an AMP landing page. And that is great because it also means that if you are speaking to, say, senior stakeholders in your company and trying to justify why something like AMP will make sense, I think one of the key points that you can talk about is that it doesn't tie up a lot of your development resources. It is usually less resource intensive. Also, another thing that should be kept in mind is that when you're working on AMP, you're not restructuring a website, you're essentially working on a landing page, which means that all you need to do is essentially make sure that one page works well, and as long as that is in place, like they say, like the first page is probably the hardest to publish, and from that point onwards, it should be fairly easy for you to ramp up on the other pages of your website. So that's another key USP of why you should be considering using AMP, is because essentially it doesn't tie up a lot of your development resources. Another example, and this one was from the hospitality segment. Millwood Inn and Suites is a small bed and breakfast kind of a business that works out of the US, and what they found was that after using AMP, they were able to see 83% increase in transactions and 52% increase in revenue. Again, for a small business like Millwood Inn and Suites, it's huge to be able to see these kinds of numbers, which also goes on to tell us that, as a product itself, as a technology itself, AMP sort of helps businesses from all different categories, from all sizes and shapes. eBay has actually been one of the biggest sort of torchbearers for AMP right from its initial days. In the latest Google I/O, they announced that there were almost 15 million AMP pages that eBay has published across product categories. I understand that there was a question in the G+ page about e-commerce products. I would definitely suggest that you take a closer look at eBay's example and how they're really structuring their AMP pages. It's a great sort of precedent to look up to in terms of how widely can you apply AMP across different offerings on your website. And in its sense, why we consider AMP to be much faster is, firstly, it's simplified in terms of its page structure. Definitely, we promote the use of less JavaScript, which often is an offender when it comes to helping websites load faster. It also optimizes the bandwidth a bit better with async load. And I know we've spoken about this earlier as well. This is something that AMP really holds key to its core. And the cached pages, which end up making up that 1 second experience, which means that through the Google's AMP cache, all these web pages are served, and that essentially leads to a 1 second experience. Now, even if your web pages are not being cached, but you're following most of the principles with AMP, what we see is that even raw AMP pages have about 40 to 50% faster load times than pages that are not AMP. So even if you don't want to go through the cache route, even if you just create a web page with the AMP standards in place, you will definitely start seeing a lot more improvement in your speed. With the incoming surge of more e-commerce players getting involved with AMP, we've worked on several, say, types of AMP use cases that you should be able to see on ampexample.com. Some of the ones that I've already listed over here is a home or category demo. You can also see a product listing demo. We've also made sure that other e-commerce features like related products or search in line, all of these things are already in place. We will be posting a couple of resources on the G+ page soon, so I would definitely recommend that you go ahead and look at all of those. But like I said, with more commercial applications occurring with AMP, we are stressing and doubling down on making sure that all kinds of resources are available to you for you to use. We've also been investing a lot in making sure that AMP leads to faster ad experiences, and I believe all of you are here because you have some sort of an advertising relationship with Google. And one of the things that we are extremely excited about is the use of AMP as an AdWords landing page. Starting the end of this month, any AdWords account that leads an ad towards an AMP landing page will automatically be cached. Now, this was not available earlier, but starting the end of this month, we will be rolling it out to all advertisers around the world. So that is, again, something that should really help you shape up, especially your holiday strategy, because we're not too far away from the holiday season. And you can really make sure that you're getting the most out of your ad investment, or at least not losing any money just because the website is a lot slower than what a user wants. Lastly, I think I mentioned a lot of examples from the US, but just wanted to wrap up with an example that we saw in Europe already. If you want to go through this case study, it's a great case study. I'll give you the few main takeaways from it, but all you need to do is just search for Think with Google space Monetti. This is a Swedish financial services website, And what they essentially did was they used AMP for their AdWords landing pages, and they saw almost 19% increase in their conversion volumes just by using AMP over the regular landing page. Now, what was key to note over here was that it wasn't that Moneti's landing page was slow. It was already loading in about 4 seconds. But just by using AMP, they were able to get that 1 second experience, that the load time is reduced. But it also tells you that even if your website is pretty optimized at about 4 seconds, which we consider to be really good, there's still scope for improvement with a technology like AMP. The other thing was, and this is why I took screenshots of both versions of the AMP and the regular version. As you can see, there was little to no sacrifice that was made on the UX. And this tends to be a common perception a lot, that just by using AMP, you need to sacrifice elements of your user experience. But as you can see over here, that wasn't the case. Moneti was absolutely able to replicate the same experience on their AMP page as they would have on their regular version. So I hope all of these examples and pieces of information were useful to you. We will be posting more on the G+ page and probably send off the links in the live chat as well. But if you have any questions, just keep posting them on the G+ page. I believe our team has already been responding to a few. I'll just see if in case there were any that were missed out on. And I'll probably address a few of those. I believe Simon wrote into us about he was using an AMP page and was getting an F on first byte time through the web page test results. And as it was answered in the comments as well, we did go through the web page test results, and what we found is that essentially what was delaying the first byte load time was that it was taking about 4 seconds for the server to get back and start fetching the resources. That was the main cause of delay. I think that because again, web page test doesn't take into account the cached version of your results. This is it just trying to evaluate how your raw AMP page works. Probably it may not be the case that it takes as much time on the cached version, because that part of it would already be sorted. But if you're trying to test the raw version of the AMP page, what we're able to see is that it's definitely, I think, something that is delaying the DNS call. All right. Just... So Bart had asked a question again, like I think we gave an example through the AMP example resource. But another thing that I think is relevant to note over here is that while we're testing with AMP, as you can see in when you're searching for, say, a news article like, say, Brexit, you will often find like a carousel sort of a delivery system for AMP. And that is specific to the news and content industry. We're constantly testing out new ways of delivering AMP that may not be available for e-commerce applications just yet, but in the future we might be testing out different delivery mechanisms on search with regards to AMP. So I hope that sort of adds a bit more context to your question. Yeah, this was an interesting question on slider performance. Again, we've been big on say no to sliders for your website for some time. The question is that is the slider performance on desktop the same as that on mobile? So essentially, would it delay the loading time as much on the mobile side as it would on desktop? I think desktop load times tend to be a bit better usually because you mostly have access to a high-speed network. But definitely anything that you can do to make your website faster is worth trying at least. For desktop, what we would recommend is probably do like an A/B test and see which version of it works better. It's not that A lot of leading companies don't use sliders, but if they at all do, they try to make sure that it's as customized for the user as possible as well. So you might see some examples of, say, companies like Amazon using sliders, but what they do is essentially make sure that the slider itself is pretty customized for the user at the end of the day. So for desktop, definitely it's worth doing an A/B test for, but for mobile, given that most mobiles networks do not have as much or as high bandwidth in terms of network speeds, we would definitely recommend that you use a static image instead of a slider. Right. All right. So I think that was it from my end around what I had to share about AMP. Like I said, we will be sharing more resources on both the live chat and on the G+ page. But if you have any more questions, keep on writing it in, and we will be back with you shortly in about half an hour or so. So we'll probably get back online at about 11 in case you have any further questions. But other than that, it would be a wrap from our end. Thanks a lot for your patience and taking out the time. Hi, everyone. We're back, and I just wanted to take stock of the questions that have been asked on the G Plus page. I know we've been answering quite a few of them on the G Plus page itself. Some of them really, I think it's better that we share with the entire group in case you've not seen the kind of questions that some of the other people who've logged in have asked. I think I'll start off with one that we received on AMP and how it compares to similar projects like Facebook Instant Pages, and Baidu has a similar initiative in China. Apple News also had a similar initiative going on. So it's something that we see as an industry-wide sort of an initiative to make sure that the mobile web in itself becomes a lot faster. The good thing about AMP is that we've seen a fair amount of success with it, and that has been recognized across the industry. And what has recently happened over the course of the last 6 months or so is that, say, Facebook instant articles, they've already become compatible with AMP. So if you have an AMP page, they will conform to the Facebook instant articles guidelines. Baidu also, I think around this year in March, Baidu announced that AMP will become compatible to their search engine as well. I know Bing has already been a partner with AMP for the longest time right now. So we're constantly seeing more and more partnerships evolving, and we hope that AMP will soon become like a web standard that will help make sure that once you deploy AMP on your website, you can possibly use it in multiple avenues apart from just Google organic search. All right. Take up another question from Thomas around for those who are new to AMP. It's basically to do with what happens to your usual URL, the regular landing page of your, say, products, when you create the AMP version as well. What we recommend is that you do keep a separate URL for AMP and a separate URL for the responsive version of the website. And what you can do is just link them. There is a link ref sort of a code that you need to put that directs the canonical page to the AMP page and hyperlinks the AMP page to the canonical page, and that way the Google caching system would recognize that there is an AMP version of this page available, and it would prefer fetching that than the responsive version of the website or the canonical version. I hope that helps you. Let me just pick up another question. So Bart gave us a question around image compression. He mentioned that he wasn't very satisfied with the image compression results that he was getting out of the Google tool. I presume you were using the PageSpeed Insights for this. If at all you feel that the quality of the images are not that great through PageSpeed results, definitely what you can do is look at an alternative, like there is tinypng.com or there is Optimizilla. I think both of these tools give you enough sort of oversight about how the photo quality is, as well as making sure that you can probably compress it to the maximum possible extent. We'll be sending over the links both as a comment to your question and in the live chat as well. But like I said, I think compression is important. If you're not happy with the quality of the compression, obviously we would recommend that you go ahead and look out for an alternative. We don't want you to blindly follow a compression if it's not meeting the quality you want on your website. And by the way, that's a good feedback, and we will be passing it out passing it on to the PageSpeed Insights team as well. All right. We had another question that was actually sent by Tommy. It was answered within a comment, so a lot of people may not have been able to see it. But it's an interesting sort of, I guess, an existential question when we talk about mobile speed. So I just read it out verbatim. It's advised to load stuff as fast as possible on the page, and PageSpeed helps your ranking on Google. But what about user interaction when loading the pages with, say, critical path loading? So is it better to load the page before, even though it's not accessible or interactive for a user? And wouldn't that constitute a broken page experience where you can see everything and not click on anything? Or is it better to allow the critical JS part to get loaded, so at least that the content, when that comes up, it's at least interactive? I think it's a good question on two aspects, especially because it tends to bring up the perception of speed in this discussion, and also the fact around why certain websites might take up a huge amount of time just to get the functionality in place before anything really shows up on the website. From most of the extensive researches that we've seen, it really speaks about how the user perception of speed is heavily dependent on what elements are being served on the website. And Bas has answered this question on the Jesus page as well. But I think one of the things that is important to understand is that the user perception of speed is heavily dependent on the elements that are visually interactive. So even if you can't get the entire functionality of the JavaScript up in place in say the first 3 or 4 seconds, you should make sure that at least basic elements of the website or the structure of the website is visible, so that there is incentive for the user to wait rather than look at a blank screen for say about 4 seconds and then probably some elements coming up. And most of us, I mean, if you just look at it intuitively and from your personal experience, I'm pretty sure like none of you have waited for say 5 seconds for one element to load on a website before you went back and say maybe searched for an alternative or a competitor. So I think it's a fine line to walk on. We definitely don't want users to have a broken page experience, but on the same hand, you also need to make sure that the users have enough visual interaction, even if it's not the tap interaction. At least there's a lot more visual interaction that incentivizes the user to stay on until the entire code is loaded up for the website. All right, let me check out some other questions. I hope all of you have seen the AMP by example resource. I think it's great for most of your questions. You must have also seen an AMP for e-commerce guide that we've just posted on the G+ page. I think there were a couple of questions around, what happens post the AMP page interaction, which I think is an interesting concept, because what we look at AMP as is that you load some of your most valuable pages to new visitors at the fastest amount of time as possible. But what happens once they move on after that AMP page interaction? And I think from that point of view, what's important to understand is that, which is why a lot of the maintenance needs to happen on your website, because it shouldn't be that the first page loads in 1 second and the next pages take 10 seconds or 12 seconds to load. In terms of more interactivity and better user experience, a lot of developers have started integrating experiences of a progressive web app with accelerated mobile pages. And progressive web apps is a slightly more heavy discussion, which we probably will not go into. But if you already feel that you've hit say a certain saturation point with AMP and you want to customize your website a bit further and say bring on more cutting edge features to the website itself, I would definitely recommend that you go ahead and pick up on some amount of information related to progressive web apps. We've been seeing a lot of companies like, say, the Washington Post. We'll also be posting a couple of videos from this company called Vigo, which has actually combined AMP, PWA, and a lot of our payment APIs all together. And I believe possibly it's one of the best sort of mobile web experiences out there. So if you're looking for something to do after the point when you feel you've covered all bases with AMP, I would definitely suggest that you go ahead and look up progressive web apps as well. All right, I think most of the questions on the G+ page have been answered. If you have any more questions, you can probably put it on the live chat, or I mean, you will have access to us even beyond this Hangout on Air. I hope if you found this useful, we can probably do another version of this in the future as well. But if you have any further questions, just make sure that you write into us. We will be looking at the Google Plus page regularly and respond to you as soon as we get the time. But that's it from my end. I hope you had an informational session and you learned new things. We really look forward to seeing these being implemented on your websites and seeing a good amount of traction at your end. And let's make the Google Plus page that you already have something that's more like a living document. And please keep on posting your questions. We'll be looking at it and we'll try to respond as soon as possible. Thanks a lot. That's it from my end. Yeah, goodbye.